For Eleanor, nothing mattered more than family. That had always been her unshakable belief. So when her daughter invited her to move in, she thought to herself, this will be the most peaceful final chapter of my life. She imagined finding joy in the sound of children's laughter, until the concert ticket she had looked forward to all month stayed tucked in her wallet, forgotten after a sudden 11 a.m. phone call. The armchair where she used to read every evening now sat abandoned in the garage, replaced by a baby stroller, and the cabinet that once held her quiet journals, now packed with diapers, Legos, and rechargeable toy batteries. No one said anything out loud, but everything seemed to whisper to her, Mom, we'd love your help, as long as you don't need anything in return. Music fades to a slower, deeper rhythm. The house remained warm, but Eleanor was growing cold, from the inside out. This isn't a tragedy. It's an awakening, the story of a woman who lost herself in love and had the courage to step out and reclaim her identity when no one else would do it for her. Call to reflection, drawing the viewer in. Are you living your own life or just playing a part in someone else's story? Stay with us until the end of this video, not just to understand Eleanor, but to understand yourself. After more than 40 years in the same red brick house in Ohio, a place once filled with her husband's violin music and quiet mornings with black tea, Eleanor folded a hand-knit scarf, packed a few suitcases, and left. She wasn't running away. She was going toward something, or so she hoped. Her daughter needed her, and deep down, Eleanor believed this move would be the beginning of something gentle and meaningful. Maybe even the peaceful final chapter she had quietly wished for. She arrived in Oregon to a small, tree-lined town near the Cascade Mountains, where her daughter Grace lived with her husband Tom and their 2 children. Grace was a nurse, Tom an engineer, and the kids, Leo, 6, and little June, 3, were full of energy, noise, and the kind of chaos that somehow warmed the house instead of breaking it. The day Eleanor moved in, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and toast. The whole family had gathered around the kitchen island. June, grinning mischievously, smeared ketchup into the shape of a heart on her sandwich, while Leo bounced on his toes and asked, Grandma, do you know how to make chocolate chip cookies? No one makes them better than you. He giggled as he dabbed a bit of cookie dough onto Eleanor's cheek, and June wrapped her little arms around Eleanor's leg like she was hugging her favorite tree at the playground. For the first time in months, after the quiet grief, the loneliness, the evening spent speaking to no one but the ticking clock, Eleanor felt like she belonged again. The first days passed like soft melodies. She woke up early each morning to prepare breakfast, always making Grace's childhood favorite, soft-boiled eggs with sea salt. She helped Leo build a paper model of the solar system for a class project and taught June how to sing You Are My Sunshine, letting the little girl draw out the last note like a performance on a grand stage. In the late afternoons, when golden sunlight filtered through the kitchen window and stretched across the hardwood floor, Eleanor would sit at the table, her fingers gently tracing the rim of a teacup. Sometimes she whispered to herself, maybe this is it. Maybe this is how I was meant to grow old, wrapped in the sounds of family and laughter. She felt useful, needed, even young again. The neighbors affectionately referred to her as the happy grandma, waving as she strolled with June through the park in her favorite blue cardigan. The refrigerator soon filled with photos, Eleanor beaming beside her grandkids, holding a plate of cookies, or reading bedtime stories in the glow of a nightlight. She began to tell herself that it was okay. Okay that she no longer wrote poetry or traveled or taught classes at the library. Here now, surrounded by family, she was doing something even more meaningful. And for a while, that felt like enough. But slowly, quietly, something began to shift. Eleanor didn't feel tired. Not exactly. But she couldn't remember the last time she slept past 7 a.m. She didn't feel sad. Still, some days in the middle of the kitchen, she'd suddenly forget what she came in to get. It wasn't anything big. Not yet. Just a faint feeling. A kind of softness where her edges used to be. And when no one was looking, she began to notice how small pieces of herself were quietly being moved aside, as if someone was rearranging her without asking. The first cracks were subtle, as fragile and invisible as hairline fractures on a wine glass, and like most fractures, they didn't hurt, until they did. Sometimes love is so gentle, so all-consuming, that we don't even hear the sound of our own voice, fading into the background. But as the days stretched into weeks, that soft feeling, the one Eleanor couldn't quite name, began to grow roots. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment of realization, no dramatic turning point. Instead, her sense of self began to fade the way a favorite photograph does, slowly, gently, almost beautifully, until the colors are just gone. At first, it was the little routines that disappeared. Eleanor had once started each day with 20 minutes of quiet meditation and classical music, a ritual she'd kept since her 40s. Now those early hours belonged to breakfast prep, school lunches, and spilled milk. Her morning stillness had been replaced by the sound of cereal clinking in bowls and someone always calling out, "Mom, Grandma." She used to walk to the public library every Thursday for a book club meeting with other retired teachers. It was the one place she could talk about characters and words and ideas that didn't wear diapers or ask for second helpings of mac and cheese. After missing 2 meetings in a row to help watch the kids, she quietly stopped going. "Just this week," Grace had said, glancing at her phone. "Next week things will calm down." But next week always had a reason. One Saturday afternoon, Eleanor received an email about a special symphony performance, her favorite composer, live, one night only. She hesitated for just a moment before clicking the RSVP link, but before she could confirm, Grace walked into the room. "Mom, we have a wedding next Saturday. You'll be home, right? We need someone to watch the kids." Eleanor closed her laptop. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. And maybe that was the part that stayed with her the longest. Not the missed performance, not the music, but the way no one had asked her what she wanted to do. It simply wasn't part of the conversation. She began to wonder, when was the last time she planned something for herself without checking who needed her first? If you're still listening and these words are touching something inside you, pause for just a second. Ask yourself, when was the last time your time belonged only to you? If that question feels uncomfortable, don't worry. You're not alone. And Eleanor wasn't either. It wasn't just the time, it was space. Her bedroom, once a place of quiet, had slowly become a makeshift storage room. Toys spilled onto the rug, a stroller leaned against the wall, and what used to be her writing desk now held charging cables and unopened Amazon boxes. One afternoon, Eleanor sat down to journal, something she hadn't done in weeks, only for Leo to burst in, grab a marker, and begin scribbling over her notebook. Grace, walking by, chuckled. "He's just a kid, Mom. You can always buy another journal." Eleanor didn't say anything. That night, she scribbled a few thoughts on the back of an old grocery receipt and tucked it into an empty cookie tin under her bed. A secret little archive of the version of herself she was trying not to lose. The walls of the house hadn't changed, but Eleanor's place within them had. She was still helpful, still needed, still loved, but in a way that came with conditions. She had become essential, yet invisible. And here's the quiet truth no one talks about. You can be surrounded by people you love and still feel like you're disappearing. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, if it's stirring something you haven't said out loud yet, pause, breathe, and know this. Naming it is the first step toward reclaiming it. So stay with me. Eleanor's story is just beginning, because even the softest voice, once rediscovered, has the power to shake an entire house. And then next, that voice, her voice, will finally whisper the words she's been afraid to say. This isn't working. Sometimes pain doesn't announce itself with a scream. It arrives quietly, in the form of silence, in the heaviness behind a smile, in the way someone sighs before answering a question they've heard one too many times. For Eleanor, it came one Tuesday afternoon. She was making lunch, grilled cheese, the kid's favorite, when she overheard Grace on the phone. Her daughter's voice was soft, hurried, the way people speak when they think no one's listening. "I honestly don't know what we'd do without Mom. She's been a lifesaver. I just wish she'd stop putting onions in everything. The kids hate it, and she keeps doing it." It was one sentence, that's all. But something about it landed deep, like a cold drop of rain that finds the warmest part of your back. Eleanor stood still for a moment, butter knife in hand, the bread half toasted on the pan. She wasn't hurt by the onions. She was hurt by the fact that everything she did, every effort, every quiet sacrifice, was being measured, judged, quietly reshaped into a list of mild annoyances. She'd given up so many little parts of herself. And for what? Not for praise. She didn't need that. But maybe just to be seen, to be understood, to feel like she still had a say. Later that evening, after bedtime stories and 2 rounds of "Can I have water?", Eleanor sat alone at the dining table, the lights dimmed. Her tea had gone cold. She wrapped her hands around the mug anyway, as if the shape alone could offer comfort. She looked around the room. The room she cleaned, the room she decorated with photos of others. There was no photo of her alone. No trace of the woman who once taught literature to hundreds of students, who once backpacked across Europe at 55, who once wrote poems on napkins during train rides and dreamed of publishing a little book of her own. Where had she gone? Maybe that's a question worth asking yourself too. Where is the version of you that you once loved? Is she resting? Is she hiding? Is she still waiting patiently for a permission slip that may never come? If that question feels too close, too raw, take a breath with me right now. You're not alone. Eleanor wasn't angry. She didn't yell. She didn't demand anything. But something inside her began to shift, subtle but real, a knowing. That night she wrote a single sentence in her makeshift journal on the back of a flyer from the school PTA. I love them, but I think I'm starting to disappear. Sometimes, the most painful part of love isn't the giving. It's the slow erosion of your identity while giving, and the terrifying moment you realize no one noticed it happening. If you've ever felt this way, like you're slowly folding yourself into smaller and smaller versions to fit the life around you, pause. You're not being dramatic. You're being honest, and honesty is the birthplace of change. Tell me, in the comments if you feel safe enough, have you ever loved so much you forgot to love yourself? Have you ever smiled so others wouldn't have to ask if you were okay? Leave me if you've ever felt like you were fading in a room full of people. You don't have to explain it. I see you, and so many others here do too. Stay with me, because in part next, something beautiful happens. A knock on the door, a familiar voice, and a friend who once got lost too, but found her way back. And this time she's here to guide Eleanor home. You won't want to miss it. The next morning felt like any other. The same soft creak of the wooden floor beneath her slippers. The same warm hum of the coffee machine. The same quiet space between helping and being seen. But just before noon, the doorbell rang. Eleanor wasn't expecting anyone. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. There, standing with a paper bag full of cookies and a smile that carried decades of shared laughter, was Sylvia. Sylvia, her old friend from college, the one who used to drag her to poetry readings and dance in the living room with a scarf and a glass of wine, declaring that freedom is a state of mind. It had been years. Sylvia, Eleanor breathed. What are you doing here? I was in the area, Sylvia said, stepping inside, and something told me you might need a visit. They sat at the kitchen table, now cluttered with coloring books and snack crumbs. Eleanor poured tea. Sylvia took a sip, then looked closely at her. You look tired, she said gently. Not just physically, the kind of tired that settles in your bones. And just like that, Eleanor's carefully built dam cracked open. The smile she'd worn so dutifully collapsed into silence. Tears welled in her eyes, not loud, not messy, just real. I don't know who I am anymore, she whispered. I love them so much, but I feel like I've become invisible, like I'm everyone's support system, but no one knows what holds me up. Sylvia didn't interrupt. She simply reached across the table and held her hand, firm and steady. I know, she said, because I've been there. She went on to tell Eleanor about her own story, how after retiring, she moved in with her son's family, thinking it would be a season of love and connection, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, she had lost herself too. Her hobbies faded. Her name became Grandma. Her voice became background noise. One day, Sylvia said, I realized I hadn't heard myself laugh in months. Eleanor looked up, eyes wide with recognition. But you seem so free now, she said. I am, Sylvia smiled, because I decided to reclaim my space, not just the physical kind, but the emotional, the spiritual, the sacred parts of myself, and I started small. That day, Sylvia had packed her bags, found a cozy little apartment with a sunny balcony, and began painting again. She joined a yoga class for seniors, started journaling in the mornings, and reconnected with the woman she had almost lost. It wasn't easy, she said, and it didn't happen overnight. But I finally stopped waiting for permission to live my own life. Eleanor sat in silence, letting the words soak in. Maybe you need to hear that too. Maybe you've been waiting for a sign, a friend, a whisper from someone who's walked the road before you. Maybe that's why this story found you today. Tell me, when was the last time you did something just for you? Not out of obligation, not to please someone else, just because it made you feel alive? If it's been a while, let me tell you something you might need to hear. You are not selfish for wanting space. You are not ungrateful for needing rest. You are not wrong for missing the person you used to be. Drop a comment below and tell me, what's one part of yourself you'd love to reclaim? Is it your voice, your mornings, your sense of humor, or maybe just your name? Spoken with kindness. Leave number 1 if you're ready to grow again. Leave number 2 if you've ever longed to be truly seen. Sylvia didn't come to rescue Eleanor. She came to remind her of something she had forgotten. Her life was still hers, and before leaving, she handed Eleanor a folded piece of paper. Inside was a handwritten quote. The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Start small, she said, hugging her tight, but start. And with that, Eleanor stood on the porch a little taller, not because everything was fixed, but because something had shifted. Hope had returned. Quiet, but steady, like a lamp lit in a dark room. And then that flicker will become a flame, because Eleanor is about to take her first step, back home to herself. You'll want to see how it begins. That night, after Sylvia left, the house fell into its usual hush. The children were asleep. The dishwasher hummed in the background. Grace and Tom were upstairs, caught in their own worlds of work, emails, and late-night to-do lists. Lenore sat in the kitchen, the quote from Sylvia still unfolded in her hands. The only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. She read it once, then again, and something stirred, soft, fragile, but real. The next morning, she didn't set an alarm. She woke naturally, sunlight slipping through the curtains and warming her face. For a moment, she simply laid there, listening. To the quiet, to her breath, to the silence that didn't demand anything from her. When she did get up, she didn't rush to the kitchen. Instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and stepped out onto the back porch, barefoot, still in her robe. The grass was damp. The air was crisp. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was behind on anything. She was exactly where she needed to be. Later that day, Eleanor made a phone call. Her voice trembled slightly when she spoke, but she didn't apologize for it. She called the local community center and asked about the painting workshop Sylvia had mentioned. The woman on the phone was warm and welcoming. There was still space. Classes met every Tuesday. No experience necessary. Eleanor hesitated only for a second before saying yes. She hung up, her heart racing, not from fear, but from a kind of nervous excitement she hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, while the kids napped, she went to her room and opened the old box beneath her bed, the one where she kept her cookie tin journal. She pulled out a few crumpled receipts and scribbled something new. Today I chose myself, just a little, but enough to remember I still exist. And maybe that's where real change begins, not in grand gestures or dramatic exits, but in the smallest acts of remembering. A walk alone, a yes to something new, a no without guilt. What about you? What's one small thing you could do this week? Just for you? Not because it's productive, not because it helps someone else, just because it brings you back to yourself. Maybe it's picking up that book you keep putting off. Maybe it's eating breakfast outside, in the sun, without your phone. Maybe it's letting yourself cry without rushing to explain why. If you feel like sharing, leave a comment below. What would your first step back to yourself look like? Write it down. Name it. Honor it. Drop a flower if you're ready to begin again, even if you're scared. Drop a leaf if you've taken even the tiniest step already. You deserve to be whole. You deserve to be seen, not just as mom or grandma or the helpful one, but as you. That night, Eleanor laid out a small canvas on her desk. She found an old box of paints in the garage, half dried, but still usable. She dipped the brush into soft blue. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even good, but it was hers. And with each brushstroke, something inside her began to loosen, something that had been wound too tightly for too long. Freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet Tuesday and a woman brave enough to start again. Eleanor will face a conversation she's been avoiding, a talk with Grace, one filled with truth, fear, and maybe, for the first time, mutual understanding. Come back for that moment, because learning how to love without losing yourself is something so many of us are still trying to figure out, and we're doing it together. It took Eleanor 3 days to gather the courage, 3 mornings of standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing the words, 3 nights of whispering into her pillow, maybe tomorrow. But it wasn't until she saw Grace at the sink, shoulders tense, hair falling from a rushed ponytail, eyes tired in a way Eleanor recognized in herself, that she knew. Waiting any longer would be another kind of silence. And she'd had enough of those. So after dinner, when the kids were upstairs and the dishes were drying on the rack, Eleanor took a breath that reached all the way down to the quietest part of her chest. Grace, she said softly, can we talk for a minute? Her daughter turned, confused at first, then concerned. She pulled out a chair, sat down. Eleanor didn't ease into it. She didn't dress it up. I think it's time for me to live somewhere else. The room stilled. At first, Grace just stared at her, as if she hadn't heard the words correctly. What do you mean? She asked. Is something wrong? Did I do something? Eleanor smiled. not out of dismissal, but out of love. No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong. None of you did. You've been kind and welcoming and grateful. But I've realized something. I've slowly stopped being me, and I miss her. She paused, searching for the right words. I miss having my own mornings. I miss choosing how I spend my days. I miss the parts of myself that don't revolve around serving others. And it's not because I don't love you all. It's because I do. And I want to love you from a place that's full, not empty. Grace blinked, eyes glistening. There was hurt there, yes, and confusion, but beneath it something else, recognition. Mama? She whispered. Why didn't you say something sooner? I didn't know how, Eleanor replied. And maybe I was scared that choosing myself would feel like abandoning you. But now I know it's not about leaving. It's about returning to who I was, and maybe even to the mother you knew before life asked so much of her. They sat in silence for a while. Sometimes love doesn't look like staying. Sometimes it looks like stepping away, so the bond can breathe again. Grace reached out and held her mother's hand. If this is what you need, she said, voice trembling, then I'll help you find a place. And when we visit, I'll bring the kids and your favorite tea and maybe even those terrible onion crackers you love. Eleanor laughed through tears, and in that moment something unspoken passed between them, a soft surrender, a shift. The understanding that love isn't about possession or proximity, it's about presence and permission. What about you? Is there a conversation you've been holding back, maybe with someone you love or maybe with yourself? What would it sound like if you finally spoke the words that have been pressing on your heart? Drop a white heart in the comments if there's something you've been needing to say. Drop a sun icon if you've already said it and you're still healing from how it landed. And if you feel brave enough, share a line of that truth. You never know who you might set free by saying it out loud. That night, Eleanor sat on the porch alone. But it didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like expansion. She was scared, yes, but also lighter. She had spoken the truth, and the world hadn't fallen apart. In fact, it had gotten a little quieter, a little clearer. Eleanor takes the leap, a new apartment, new rhythms, and the unexpected joy that comes from rediscovering what it means to live for herself, not out of duty, but out of delight. You won't want to miss it, because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose the life we were never taught we were allowed to have. The day Eleanor moved into her new apartment, the sky was soft with morning light. The air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just freer, like something had been unclenched. It wasn't a grand place. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a tiny balcony barely big enough for 2 chairs and a potted plant. But it was hers, and that made all the difference. The movers came and went. Grace helped unpack the boxes. Leo drew a picture of Grandma's new castle and hung it on the fridge with a ladybug magnet. June gave her a tiny stuffed rabbit to keep you safe at night. They laughed, hugged, promised weekend visits, and then, as the door closed gently behind them, Eleanor stood in the quiet. No one needed juice. No one called her name. No one asked for anything. She exhaled and didn't realize until that very moment that she'd been holding her breath for years. That night, she sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by half-opened boxes and the gentle glow of a single lamp. She made tea the way she liked it, strong, no sugar, a squeeze of lemon. She opened the window, let the wind speak for a while, and allowed herself to do nothing. And in that nothing, she began to hear herself again. The next morning, she woke without an alarm. She lingered in bed, not out of laziness, but out of luxury. She watched the sun creep across the ceiling, listened to the birds, and let herself feel the quiet not as loneliness, but as spaciousness. Later, she painted. The canvas was modest. Her strokes were hesitant at first, but with each color, something inside her softened. She painted not for display, not for approval, just to remember what it felt like to create, to feel beauty pour through her hands again. And in the evenings, she read, out loud, to herself. Sometimes poetry, sometimes old letters, sometimes nothing at all. Just the sound of her own voice filling the room again. She wasn't escaping her family. She was finding her way back to them by finding her way back to herself. And isn't that something we all deserve? To return to ourselves. To rebuild a life that holds us, not just one we hold together for others. What would that look like for you? If you had a room of your own, whether literal or emotional, what would you place in it? Would it smell like lavender? Would it sound like jazz? Would it be filled with light? Or the kind of silence that finally lets your thoughts rise to the surface? Tell me in the comments, what have you been longing for? Not in a dramatic way, but in those small, aching whispers just before sleep. Drop a tree icon tree if you dream of planting something just for yourself. Drop a book icon if there's a story inside you that's been waiting to be told. Drop a lock icon if you're ready, truly ready, to be free. Because here's the truth. Freedom doesn't always look like bold leaps or dramatic decisions. Sometimes it looks like choosing the mug you like best. Sometimes it's saying no with love. Sometimes it's hanging a picture that makes you smile. Sometimes it's doing nothing and knowing that nothing is yours. Eleanor didn't change overnight. The world didn't suddenly bend to her desires. She still felt guilt sometimes, and she missed the kids more than she expected. But she also noticed something beautiful. The more she filled her own cup, the more joy she brought when she visited. She laughed more easily. She listened more deeply. She became, once again, not just a caretaker, but a woman with stories to tell and light in her eyes. And maybe that was the point all along. We'll see how Eleanor's quiet transformation begins to ripple outward into her relationship with her daughter, her grandchildren, and even herself. Because when one woman dares to live fully, she invites others to do the same. And maybe that ripple begins with you too. It started subtly, as most ripples do. After Eleanor moved into her own place, weekends with the grandchildren became something special, not just routine, not just expected. The visits were filled with laughter, long walks to the park, stories told while baking cookies, and the kind of attention that only comes from someone who has taken time to refill their own soul. Grace noticed it first. "Mama, you look lighter," she said one afternoon as they sipped tea on Eleanor's tiny balcony. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary from a potted plant, and Grace watched as her mother leaned back in her chair with a calm she hadn't seen in years. "I feel lighter," Eleanor replied, "not because I have less to carry, but because I stopped carrying what was never mine to hold." Grace was quiet, but something inside her softened. In the weeks that followed, Grace started making small changes of her own. She blocked off 1 hour each Sunday, just for herself. No errands, no chores, no expectations. Sometimes she used it to read. Sometimes she sat in silence. Sometimes she just breathed. Tom noticed too. With Eleanor no longer in the house, he and Grace had to relearn how to share the load, not just practically, but emotionally. There were more conversations, more apologies, more effort. And the kids? Well, children notice more than we give them credit for. Leo began drawing again, not just silly cartoons, but quiet scenes of his grandma painting or sitting under a tree. June insisted on watering Eleanor's rosemary every time they visited, and during one sleepover while brushing her teeth, she looked up and said, "Grandma, you smile more now." Eleanor kissed her forehead, blinking back tears. "You helped me remember how," she whispered. And maybe that's the magic we forget when we silence ourselves for too long, when we disappear behind the needs of everyone else. We forget that joy is contagious, that healing is visible, that when one person begins to live truthfully, others feel it. They begin to wonder, what if I could do that too? What if you could? What would happen if you gave yourself permission to grow again, to shift again, to rest, to be seen? What might it change in your children, in your partner, in the way your family sees you, not just as the glue or the helper or the strong one, but as a person with her own pulse, her own dreams? If that question stirs something in you, hold it gently. Breathe with it. Leave a comment and tell me, what's one way you've seen your change affect someone else? Even if it was small, even if no one said thank you, even if they didn't notice right away. Drop a heart icon if someone's joy once made you feel braver. Drop a smiley face icon if your healing inspired someone else, and maybe you didn't even realize it, because that's how ripple effects work. Quietly, softly, until one day, a whole room feels warmer because one person dared to light a match. In the final part of Eleanor's story, we'll come full circle. She'll sit down with her grandchildren and tell them something she's never said out loud. Not just a story from her past, but a truth about love, about growing older, and about why the most beautiful thing you can ever become is fully yourself. You won't want to miss it, because maybe, just maybe, your story is ready to ripple too. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. The air was soft with late summer warmth. Eleanor sat on her balcony, her favorite mug in hand, the rosemary plant beside her now blooming with delicate purple flowers. She just finished rearranging her bookshelf, not out of necessity, but because it brought her a kind of quiet joy. Order. Beauty. Leo and June arrived around 3, full of energy and stories. They ran through the door like they always did, like it was their second home, and in many ways it was. That day, Eleanor had planned something different, not cookies, not painting, just a moment. She set a blanket in the living room, sat down cross-legged, and patted the space beside her. "Come here," she said gently. "I want to tell you something." The kids settled in, wriggling, giggling, still catching their breath. Then they looked at her, really looked, and waited. Eleanor took a breath, not nervous, not rehearsed, just honest. "When I was younger, I thought being a good mom, a good grandma, meant always giving, always helping, always being there." She smiled softly, and I love doing that. I still do. But somewhere along the way, I forgot something really important. The room grew quiet, as if even the walls were listening. I forgot that I was a person too, with dreams, with feelings, with things I still wanted to learn and do and become. I spent a long time thinking that growing older meant growing smaller, that love meant shrinking myself so everyone else could stretch. She paused, let the words land, then continued, her voice steady. "But you know what I've learned?" Both children leaned in, wide-eyed. "I've learned that love doesn't mean disappearing. Love means showing up as your full self, so the people around you learn how to do the same." Leo tilted his head. "Like being brave?" Eleanor smiled. "Yes, but also being kind, especially to yourself." She looked at June, who was twirling a strand of hair, being kind enough to rest when you need it, to say no when your heart says no, to dance even when no one is watching, and to speak your truth, even if your voice shakes. She took their little hands in hers. "My gift to you isn't just stories, or snacks, or sleepovers. My gift to you is permission to grow, to change, to live a life that feels true, not just easy, not just expected, but yours." And for a moment, no one said anything. There was just the sound of love, the kind that doesn't need noise to be felt. Later that night, after Grace picked up the kids, Eleanor sat by her window, the sky a deep shade of twilight. She looked out, not with longing, but with peace, because she had said what needed saying, because she had lived what needed living. And now her story wasn't just hers anymore, it had been passed on, quietly, gently, fully. And maybe that's the real definition of legacy, not what you leave behind, but what you awaken in those still becoming. So let me ask you, what truth inside you still wants to be spoken? What part of yourself are you ready to stop apologizing for? What legacy do you want to live? Not one day, but now? Drop a like if you're ready to pass on something deeper than advice. Comment, "I want to be happy," if you're writing a new chapter for your family by becoming who you truly are. And if this story touched your heart, share it. Send it to someone who needs a gentle reminder that it's never too late to come home to themselves. Because maybe, just maybe, the greatest gift you'll ever give your family is the courage to fully live your own life. Thank you for being part of this journey. And if you've listened this far, write in the comments, "Coming home starts within." That way I'll know you're one of the brave ones, one of the souls who stayed through every breath, every word, every quiet moment of truth. Until next time, keep the light on. And don't forget, you're allowed to shine in your own name. If this story touched you, even in the smallest way, if it reminded you of someone you love or helped you see yourself a little more clearly, don't let it end here. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Let us know what part of Eleanor's journey felt like yours. And if you want more stories like this, stories that hold space for aging, healing, reflection, and rebirth, subscribe to Golden Wise Elders. This is a place for hearts that have lived, for hands that have given, and for souls still becoming. So hit that like button if you felt seen. Share it with someone who may be quietly carrying too much. And join our growing circle, because wisdom isn't about age. It's about choosing to live with open eyes and an open heart. Until next time, we'll be right here, waiting with the next story.